Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on Environmental, Social and Governance ESG 101 for Charities, organized by Bono SG and EY. My name is Liyen and I am your moderator. To ensure that you get the most out of today's session, here are some housekeeping matters to take note of. First of all, Q&A. Today we will be using Pigeonhole Live for our Q&A session. You can submit your questions at any point during the webinar and also vote for the questions by others that you would like to have answered. If you have a smartphone or tablet with you, just launch your internet browser and enter www.pigeonhole.at into the address bar. Then key in our event passcode, which is 23 ESG 101, as shown on the slide. Alternatively, you can click on the link shared in the chat function to launch Pigeonhole Live on your device. If you are viewing this webinar on your desktop or laptop, you should receive an invitation to launch Pigeonhole. Next, useful information. A link will be shared in the chat function to access the handouts for today's webinar. The link will also be provided in the follow-up email, which we will send tomorrow. And finally, please note that today's discussion is not intended to substitute any form of legal advice. If you require specific legal advice, please consult a lawyer. With that, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our distinguished speakers for today's webinar. Anil Changaroth and Nhan Quang, co-head of ESG Practice and partner of Appropriate Dispute Resolution Practice. Anil is an accredited mediator, arbitrator, adjudicator, and dispute board, restorative justice, and ODR practitioner at RHTLaw Asia. In May 2023, Anil was appointed by the Law Society of Singapore as the chairperson for the ESG Working Group. Anil, tell us, when did you begin to take an interest in ESG?
Okay, that's an interesting point. Maybe if I could just start by explaining ESG, right? Many of you may have heard the word ESG, but what it essentially means is E is the environmental aspects, to make sure that whatever business you're in, that you comply with some sustainable requirements and make sure that the projects that you're involved does not affect the environment. So that's environmental. Social is about how you deal with your employers, employees, and your relationship in your company and how you run. This is just a quick overview. And governance is how the company is run and managed by the right kind of people, whether or not they are in conflict, whether or not they are neutral and all of that. So if you take that ESG as an element, I'm mainly a dispute resolution practitioner. So in truth, it all boils down to all of this. Right, the kind of work that I do. So for example, if I'm doing front-end advisory work for construction companies, because 50% of my work is construction, that relates to the environmental angle, right? On the social, if you're talking about employer-employee relationships and the problems that they have, that comes under social. And then how you deal with, like, say, for example, you have companies and you've got shareholder disputes and directors and problems with that kind of comes under governance, right? So I have been doing that for a long time. But precisely focusing on ESG, I think it was a year and a half, 2 years ago, I've started speaking on climate change conflict and how those can be resolved by mediation. So I've spoken in Houston at a Rotary International Convention. I've spoken in Vancouver, in Switzerland, and all that. Interestingly, on the social part, last year I did a graduate certificate from Cambridge University's business school on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Oh,
right. So that's a very interesting topic. If we have time, we'll speak a little bit about that. But it's something more not so Asia-centric, but it is a part of it. So, deep down inside, I think maybe 2 years now.
Right. Thank you. That was an excellent summary of your journey into ESG. Our second speaker, Nhan, is partner of climate change and sustainability services at EY. She is an experienced risk and sustainability professional with 14 years in consulting practices and private organizations. Nhan has worked with leading companies in private and public sectors across Asia, Pacific, Europe, and the US. She is a strong advocate for sustainable business practices. Nhan, I understand you help organizations determine their sustainability focus area and also to work out a sustainability implementation roadmap. Can you tell us a little bit more about this work?
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So I think Anil has given a very quick introduction about what's the ESG, and I think he gave some examples. But I think one of the key things about sustainability is that it's a very broad concept, right? ESG are specific matters that you consider under the very broad umbrella of sustainability. So one of the key things about sustainability is it's going to look different for different type of organizations, right? So if you are going, for example, if you operate in agriculture, the type of ESG matters that you're going to look at will be very different with, like Anil mentioned, the construction companies, right? So I work with the organizations across a different size, different sectors, also sometimes public agency as well, to determine what are going to be the most relevant ESG matters for their organizations, not only for the sector, the type organizations, but also the size of the organization. And that is when the implementation roadmap comes in. You might not want to do everything the first year if you don't have enough resource. You can phase it out. How does it make sense for you? So that's the kind of things that I work with my clients on day in, day out.
Well, it's perfect for today's talk. We really look forward to this discussion with the two of you. We were expecting a third speaker on our panel, Veron, but she had to miss this talk and she sends her apologies. She's had to miss it for medical reasons. Okay, let's dive deep into our topic today. First, I'd like to set out the context for today's discussion. So on the 4th of April this year, the Charities Council issued the revised Code of Governance. This code will take effect on 1st of January 2024. Several talks and conversations with the Commissioner of Charities and the Charity Council have been organized since April to discuss and to explain the revisions to the new Code of Governance. Today's talk focuses on the new ESG requirements which has been introduced to the charity sector via this Code of Governance. What we aim to do this afternoon is to discuss why ESG has been introduced to the code, what ESG means, and specifically what it means for charities. We will talk about implementation, challenges that you may face, and discuss concrete ideas you can practice in your unique contexts. We have taken note of the questions you have posed during registration, and the aim of this talk is to answer them as best we can. So with that, let's delve a little bit deeper into what ESG is and why now we are introducing ESG for charities. So correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that ESG reporting gained momentum among corporations maybe in the last decade, 2000s onwards. Perhaps we can start by talking about how that developed and came to be an important component for companies today and why it has become a need for charities to implement ESG practices now. So Anil, would you like to start the ball rolling?
Yeah. So interestingly, many of you may not know this, but it was April 2006. This was when the UN was launching what is called the Principles of Responsible Investment. That was coordinated by the UN Environmental Programs Finance Initiative and the UN Global Compact. Right. It was said that I think it was the Secretary General Kofi Annan at that point in time. He said that these principles grew out of the understanding that while finance fuels the global economy, investment decisions making does not sufficiently reflect environmental, social, and corporate governance considerations, or put another way, the tenets of sustainable development. So something that started in 2006. All right. So it's been there for a while. And what I think then happened was the Paris Agreement on climate change in 2015 kind of pushed this whole thing forward a lot more. And everybody then started getting on the bandwagon and realizing that it's really important that you pay attention to environmental concerns. And so slowly this ESG term started developing. So it's been on the table for a while. But from an accounting point of view,
Yep.
you know, and then
I think in the Singapore context, right? I think, by the way, our practice has been here since 2008, and even though it started 2006, but our first few years, the conversation was really limited to only very large organizations. But everything started in 2016 when SGX in Singapore introduced the requirements for the listed companies to start, putting out their sustainability report. And if you ask me, that really get the ball rolling, right? Because a lot more organization coming on board and to advance the conversation around sustainability. But I would say beyond the regulatory and, compliance, I think the discussion also because of the increasing awareness about sustainability, right? Last time, actually sustain is an English word, right? You just want to sustain your operations. So last time, maybe you just need to take care of your financial performance. But now I think there is an increasing awareness, the importance of social and governance matter as well. So now you need to take care of that matters under your sustainability as well. So I would say, so two things. I mean, regulatory developments really, help a lot. But I think the awareness of general public and communities also help a lot in these conversations. Yeah.
If I could just add a point, when
Yes,
when I was passing it over to her and said accountants, right? The accountants are, I think they're ahead of us all, right? And earlier on you mentioned about the sustainable reporting roadmap. So the Institute of Singapore Chartered Accountants, ISCA, has got a sustainability reporting implementation roadmap. And it's very interesting. I mean, it will be, I'll put some of these out in my slides, but they've got a guideline and a framework, and they tell you in phase 1, you look at the planning stage, phase 2, you look at the materiality assessment, then you set targets, you look at data collection, you look at reporting, and you look at assurances that you put out. So it kind of, their roadmap kind of encompasses what we're going to lead up to as we discuss all of these things. So it's very interesting that they are in the forefront of that. So, I think from a point of view of a legal practitioner, we too need to start putting some of these things framework into place so that people can appreciate what all of this is, all of what ESG is about, and the extent to which they need to focus their attention. So we'll see.
Yes, let's see. Okay, it's interesting you said that because I think during registration we received a number of questions from charities, and I can see why many of them feel quite overwhelmed. The topic, when you think about ESG, is really all-encompassing, it's big, and I think it's not a surprise for many of the smaller charities to feel that they have no clue where to begin. And even if they thought about it, it just sounds like a huge task, and cost is definitely a concern for many of them, which is something we will be addressing soon. But before we go there, since we're talking about what ESG is, one of the questions that popped up was, how is it different from SDG and CSR?
Okay. So, and feel free to chime in as well, Anil, but maybe I take the CSR first, right? And actually that's linked back to my increasing awareness earlier, right? So when you look at the history of sustainability, when it started, they correlate CSR, corporate social responsibility, with sustainability. Okay, I give some money to charities. I mean, then I'm a good corporate citizen. Okay. So that is CSR, right? Then the conversation become a bit more mature. People understand about a bit more. This is no longer just something I do outside my business. This is a part of the business, right? So they start to think about, okay, what is sustainable development? And like you say, it's very encompassing, right? So, and Anil has mentioned, like Paris Agreement, that was absolutely one of the key milestones. But another key milestone when it comes to awareness of sustainability, it actually SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, which also, interestingly, in 2015, that was the first time globally all the governments sit down and, try to define what SDG sustainable development. So they identify 17 goals, right? And each goal they set a target like no poverty, like and so on and so forth. And there's such an interesting thing is these 17 goals cover beyond environment. They cover social, they cover governance, they cover partnership and collaboration. They cover anti-corruption as well as part of the governance structure. So SDG is a framework where, globally we try to make sense of sustainability, right? So but okay, the caveat here is it doesn't mean you need to adopt on 17 goals. No organization should adopt 17 goals because I think like going back to what I said earlier, the key term here is focus and priorities. What makes sense for your organization and have a reasonable implementation roadmap.
So what you could do from that is very simple. Now that you're learning this term ESG, and you know that the UN has got these sustainable goals. So when you get your leadership on board and say, okay, listen, we need to now empower our company and our people on the ESG track, then what happens is that the companies may want to think about how they want to set out a mission, a vision. And all they have to do is look at the UN sustainable goals as the framework of which of those they want to pick.
Yeah.
So depending on the kind of industry they're in, you may want to pick 4 of those from that 17.
Yeah.
It will be applicable to you. So, while you ask that question about, that the charities and other organizations are going to be, they're kind of like wondering what do I do?
Overwhelmed.
Yes.
Yes.
You don't have to be overwhelmed. Just break
Yes.
it down slowly, take it step by step. And as we talk about, E, S, and G, you kind of have a sense of what it is. And then you kind of feel, okay, if it's my company, I think I need to prioritize on this area. Okay, but how do I then prioritize that? Go back to the UN sustainable goals and take a look at that and see whether that gives you some guidelines. Right? So you take one step at a time and you get there.
Yeah, that's the key term there, one step at a time, right?
Yeah, and sounds like an excellent place to start,
Yeah.
right? Okay, so bringing it down a little bit to our local context, especially for charities, I'd like to talk about the Singapore Green Plan 2030. So at the In Conversation with the Commissioner of Charities and Charity Council event organized at Suntec City on 4th of April this year, where the Commissioner of Charities suggested that the best place to start when thinking about ESG practices for charities here was the Singapore Green Plan 2030. That was a comment that he made. So Nhan, perhaps tell us a little bit more about the Singapore Green Plan 2030.
Yeah, that's actually another good starting point because if you find 17 goals of SDG is too many, you can start with Singapore Green Plan 2030 because they have only 5 pillars, right? So a little bit less, right? So they include city in nature, energy reset, sustainable living, green economy, and resilient future, right? And these are all public information. You can search it up. So before I go into giving some example, I just want to say that it might sound, and same thing for SDG as well. A lot of these goals might sound like it's at the national level, right? Resilient future. How can I contribute to it? The idea is not for you to achieve that goal by yourself. No organization can do that. But to think on what's going to be your meaningful contribution to it, right? And when you think about it that way, it's become a lot easier. I give you an example, right? So energy reset, which is one of the pillars under Singapore Green Plan. If you look it up, the government has identified some energy, reduction targets, right? The idea is not for you to use the same target for your organization, but you look at that and you understand, okay, under energy reset, maybe I should look at to reduce my energy consumption in my building. So directly, you are contributing to that, target of the government already, right? Same thing, sustainable living. Another pillar under Singapore Green Plan is just try to promote more sustainable consumptions pattern and reduce the waste. Then you think about your organization, how I can reduce waste so that I can also contribute to that pillar. So you repeat that process across the 5 pillars, you will definitely find something that you can contribute to, either through your own organization activities, or even just through advocacy, right? You promote the cause, it's also good enough. Yeah.
Mm.
If I could add, you see, when you talked about the green plan,
Yeah.
right? So what it is that the green plan gives you ideas and how to move forward so far as the E of the ESG is concerned. So again, like I said, it's an easy step. If you just go down and take a look at it. So like kind of things that she said, when you talk about the sustainable living, you got strengthening the green efforts in schools,
Yeah.
green commutes, green citizens, reduce waste and consumption. So just a personal example, I have a Rotary Club called the Rotary Club of Peace Builders Singapore, right? And then there are 24 Rotary clubs, and usually Rotary clubs are known for, they have meetings, regular meetings held at either restaurants or clubs, where there's food catered, and they drive in and park their cars and all of that. Whereas our club, we run our meetings out of it's free because it's called the Foundation of Rotary Club of Singapore Limited, and they have their facilities. So it's free. We bring our own food. We actually dine
Wow.
together. Most of us ride on public transport, and we get there.
Yeah.
So these are the smaller efforts that you make personally, and then you expand to your company, and then you expand to your and it might be a holding company, and you expand further. So the green plan gives you that framework of going down the
Yeah.
path of environment. So it's interesting because that helps you develop environment. Then you slowly have the social aspects and the governance, all of it. You can set up frameworks and ideas of how to move forward.
Mm. Perfect. Okay, so with that background in mind, the 5 pillars of the Singapore Green Plan is a good place to start. The 12 principles of sustainable development goals is also a good place.
17.
17, not 12. 17 principles. So let's do something a little bit technical for now, because I think for many of the charities, your starting point is always a code of governance. And that's where ESG was introduced. So we're going into a bit of specifics. Point 17 in Principle 3 of the Governance Evaluation Checklist, or GEC for 2024, states that the charity take into consideration the ESG factors when conducting the charity's activities. So for now, that is all that is mentioned about ESG in the GEC. So also at registration, several charities have raised this question. Ultimately, in fact, somebody did say, it's not a regulation, so why introduce it? But I think with the discussion that we've already had up to this point, the message is clear, I feel, right? The why should we introduce ESG into our operations and our practices is really clear. And I hope that by now you've already come on board, at least from the principal perspective. So practically speaking, charities want to know what constitutes compliance, because they need to be able to tick the box and say that I have complied. They want to know, what do we have to do to satisfy this requirement? So together with that, during the feedback and consultation stage, before the Code of Governance was introduced, there were 3 concerns that were raised by charities regarding specifically ESG. One of them was the process to measure and report the impact for ESG would be too tedious for some of them. Some were concerned with lack of resources to comply with the guideline. And one of the greatest concerns was that it would be too costly to develop an ESG framework. So with that understanding in mind of the concerns that charities face, Anil, would you like to talk about how a charity can begin the implementation process?
So to do that, let me just backtrack a little bit. So the Code of Governance was released recently. It's going to take effect from charities financial year beginning on the 1st of January 2024. Now the ESG part of it is it introduced ESG requirements for charities, recommended the charities to conduct activities with ESG factors in mind and communicate these ESG activities with the stakeholders. So that's the framework of what they have. Now, the reason behind that is because they feel that there's a need for safeguarding charities from future risk. So that means the future is going to be that you need to make sure that you have all of these things in place. As ESG-based decisions making of other sectors are also going to have an impact. So you're going to have investors who's going to come in to take a look at your charities, and they're going to ask the question, tell me about your ESG policies. What have you put into place? Right. So that's why the code of practice has got these changes. Now, interestingly, I mean, again, some of these points would be in my slides. About the code of governance, the revised code provides greater clarity on good governance guidelines for the charity sector. And it includes the environmental reference to how the charity's actions affect the environment, social framework and all of that. So it clearly spells it out. So, to take your last point about, is it going to be too tedious for them, too complicated for them? No, actually, all they have to do is just using the code and its guideline, set out a checklist, and you just tick the box. And if you start ticking the box, you know that you've dealt with it and addressed it. And when I say tick the box, right, for example, in the code, they talk to you about what environmental is. Charities are encouraged to conduct their work in an environmentally friendly and sustainable manner. That's for environmental. For social, they say charities are encouraged to align their strategy to the socially conscious and responsible means. So if you just put these wordings out in a checklist, and then you start ticking the box when you're sitting down and planning what you want to do, you're going to get there. And interestingly, as well, you talked about the principles, right? I don't know whether you mentioned the principles or not, but there are principles in there. There's a first principle. Principle 1 is the charity serves the mission and achieve the objective. Principle 2, then principle 3 is the one that's particularly for environment. It says the charity acts responsibly and fairly and with integrity. And if you go down their checklist, right, there's this principle 3 has got point 17 or something like that.
Yeah, that's the one.
Right, the one that you mentioned. And so if you look at point 17, okay, so what it does is this, if you look at the principle says the charity acts responsibly, fairly, and with integrities. And the call for action, they'll tell you whether or not the charity has put these things into effect. And if you look at number 17, point 17 says, take into consideration the ESG factors when conducting their charity activities. Then they ask you yes, no, and all that.
Yeah.
If you click on the yes, no, they'll tell you the point system. They'll give you 2 points if you fully comply, 1 point if you partially comply. And there's for good governance, as long as you achieve 61, you're okay. So again, in these principles and the pointers that they have, it's a checklist, right? So the charities don't have to freak out and say, oh my God, I need to get an expert on board and give me a full, lecture on what we need to do. Start off with a code, take a look at it, put it in a table form, go down the list, and then see what you can do about it. So it's not, to me, I think it's not daunting. Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think Anil has gone into really technical side of things, but I think maybe just look a step back and look at the concerns is the resource, right? And it's a tedious process. I guess it all boils down whether you view sustainability as outside your business or outside your operation or inside your operations. Because I think Anil also mentioned one point earlier is the reason why this was introduced because of the stakeholder concerns, right? So that means your donors, your funders or your supporters are starting to look at ESG seriously, right? So if you and you find it tedious because you feel like you have to cover everything, but it's not. Like I say, there is a prioritization process that you can do. But think about it this way, right? If your stakeholders are asking you to do this, right? You talk to them, you ask them, and then you can have a conversation. What are the most important topics from the stakeholder point of view to your organization, to the charities, right? And then now, if you don't do it, actually, it will impact your operation in the short, medium, and long term. So it's no longer a add-on, but it actually should be part of your planning for your resource to do as part of operation. I would say it's part of business as usual, to really think about it in all the things that you do. Yeah.
I do like that perspective. I think that from a perspective of principle, it really makes sense to me. However, to be really practical, you, for example, Anil, you were saying, oh, you go and check what the boxes say and then you tick it. But the problem is that the phrases that are put out there for now, they are fairly high level values and ideas, right? So if I'm a charity, I'm very busy trying to serve my community and my area of influence. It feels like I need to set aside either a staff member, somebody, an expert of some sort to crystallize this high level principles into something that I can tell the staff, oh, from tomorrow onwards, you all please, we need to start practicing. And that allows us to say, yes, we tick the box, as opposed to we have considered it. Can I tick it if I have considered it, right? And then if I have considered it, should I have considered it at board level or my executive staff maybe talked about it at office lunch or something? So I think that as we go down the check list, or rather as we go further on into the talk where we talk about environmental, social and governance in a bit more detail, and that's when we will be able to say, for example, flag out, say, certain charities who feel that is my main mission. My main mission is environmental work. So then how is this ESG going to apply, right? On a more down-to-earth practical level. So right now, I think what I've gathered so far from all the sharing is that basically this is not a box-ticking exercise. I think maybe one of the first mindset change that we're trying to achieve is to help charities see that this is not one of those okay, tomorrow we do this, A, B, C, then we take the box and we can all forget about it and move on with our lives, right? I think what community wants, investors want, and the government wants is for us as a charity group to really change our perspectives towards our operation. And as you were saying, is it something from outside your operations or within your operation? So maybe let's talk a little bit more about that.
Maybe if I could, you said two things. One, not whether or not you need to have a designated person.
Yeah.
Because it's starting to become so important, it does make sense. It's almost like, if you're in the construction industry, there was a time when the Workplace Safety and Health Act came into place. You'd have a designated person in charge of that. The PDPA, the personal data protection, you also have an assigned person on that. So eventually having an assigned person to deal with these aspects makes sense, because that particular person can always focus on the code and what the code requires you. So like, for example, we spoke about principle 3, but there's also principle 5 that says that a charity is accountable and transparent. And it tells you, what does this mean, for reporting, compliance and all that. And the Charity Council is recommending that you make sure that ESG elements are also taken care of. So having someone designated would make a lot of sense, and they are constantly looking at it. I did make it simple and say a checklist, but you got to follow through. So for example, my practice is dispute resolution work. I've been doing it for the last 27 years. And if you come into my office, you hardly see any paper. Despite
That's
the fact
impressive for legal practice.
Yeah, we don't. We have clients coming in, they will scan the documents, we return the documents to them. The last one of the major arbitration matters I had on the shipping matter, we had the opponents on the other side, a table full of documents, but we didn't have. We had just had our computers, we had it all saved up and then use it. But it has to be consistent. You got to keep going at it. You can't just do it for one arbitration and then go back to your paper. It has to be ingrained, and it must become second nature, and you're going to follow through with it every year. That's what you need to do at the end.
Yeah, and actually, I like it that you mentioned about the change and the shift in mindset, and whether I think you also point out whether the board should adopt it, and driven at the top level. The simple answer to that is that absolutely yes, right? Of course, we want to start out in a meaningful manner, and actually, even for myself as a practitioner at EY, we always want to do sustainability meaningfully, and it has to be value adding. So like I said earlier, right? If you think sustainability part of operation, you should go through that thinking process. What are the most material topics for you. What will help you to, you also mentioned how is that linked to your missions, right? It shouldn't be something you just do for the sake of doing it. There's no point you, in this, in a new case, he's a legal firm. He used a lot of paper, and then, but in another organization, if they hardly use any paper in the first place, right? Then it's no point to have that in your part of your ESG implementation roadmap. But so this mindset of doing it meaningfully, that means understand the stakeholder expectation, have the conversation first with them, right? And secondly, rationalizing how that link to your, your business, your operation and your missions. That mindset of doing it meaningfully had to be driven from the top. Because to be very, very frank with you, like you say, the people and, the operation people, you tell me 5 things that I do, right? And so that's why you need the leadership to speak up and set the directions, right? We can start our doing something small to, to keep the ball rolling and all. But at the end of the day, managing the stakeholder expectation and, set the right direction in terms of sustainability should be from, tone from the top, i.e. from the board themselves or from the senior management. Yeah. So it's a resounding yes from me for your questions.
Okay, that's really interesting. And I think we will be heartened to know that one of the top questions or that keeps coming up, which I believe is reflective of the fact that leadership within charities are really keen to implement these policies. I'm sure to many of them, they also have jobs in corporations and all that. So it's not new to them. But many of them raise the question of what is the benchmark? How is there a framework that we can refer to? And I know earlier we've already discussed, some of these starting points that we can have. But I'm curious, maybe to give a real example for charity, so that it's something that they can grasp, right? On the same topic, is there a scenario like, earlier, Anil, you were saying that the Rotary Club. Why did you start, for instance, commuting green, taking public transport, and then you said you all brought your own food and all that. So that is did you have a framework? Did you have a roadmap? So like a real example, or maybe some of the corporations that you might have consulted for, I think it might be useful for leadership to sort of like be able to refer to a real life example where you guys have either for your own charities, implemented certain things, design a roadmap or a framework of sorts. How do you go about helping? Let's say today a large charity comes to you and say, okay, fine, you help us. We have no clue where to start. And you've been telling us that, okay, we can look at the Paris, kind of agreement for a framework or the Singapore Green Plan, but still it's like, okay, there are 5 pillars. We feel a bit lost at the management level. So how does this process, perhaps for charities who might be able to afford and are considering designating an ESG plan, for themselves, how can they go forward? What does it look like in practice? Will they they'll engage someone to assess or internally assess their current ESG practices? Is that a starting point?
Okay.
How does that work?
Go ahead. Please.
I mean, we can talk about a more practical examples later on, but the process is, actually we can't walk through the process so far. And actually a lot of process that we have mentioned about could be done by your organizations. And in fact, I would be surprised if you haven't done this, right? Remember, the first thing that I talk about is understand your stakeholder expectations. That means, i.e., talk to your donors, talk to your funder, talk to your supporters, right? I would be surprised that you haven't talked to them, right?
Okay.
So what you need to do now is in your conversation with them, ask them about the ESG. Ask them a simple question. What do you think ESG means to an organization like us? Just ask a simple question, right? Is it going to be the water? Is it going to be energy? Is it going to be waste? What do you think where we have the most impact, right? And of course, you ask like, okay, what are environmental matter? What are social matter? What are governance matters? So they will tell you, and believe me, the stakeholders have a lot of opinions, right? So you already have a conversation with them. Just gather the feedback and sit down with the senior management, think through, like the feedback and how is it applied to you, right? So if the stakeholder properly tell you 10 things, they want you to do everything, right? But then out of these 10 things, how much influence I have, how much is my impact? Going back to the questions about paper consumption, it makes sense for a law firm, right? But then like in my case, I don't use paper, but I organize a lot of events. Maybe I give out a lot of goodie bags, right? For example, right? And that's also like maybe let's generate a lot of waste, right?
Yes.
So do I still need to give out goodie bags as part of my event organization, or I can do something else? So that is the part of, like I say, is a prioritization process from all the things that you receive from stakeholders. Go through one by one and think how important, from the impact that you potentially have on that matters, as well as, how is that linked to your mission and your activities. Then you will be able to narrow down a few matters that will be relevant for your organization. So that's and in fact, I mean, of course, I hope that you will look for a consultant to help you. But to be honest, right, if you are a small one, and you could do this by yourself as well, yeah.
So for me, the take is one word: mindset. It's a mindset change, right? I think charities have an advantage because you have this code that have got these principles, and if you take it down to the principle, it's got pointers to give you guides, right? So that's point number one. Point number two is that for me myself, I mean, I said Rotary. I was in Rotary for about 13 years, and it was, I suppose to some extent it's because I don't drive. I haven't been driving for 3-4 years, right? But last year I happened to be in Melbourne. Or was it this year? No, last year I was in Melbourne, and I went to visit one of the Rotary clubs, and then one of the Rotarians there had developed a software to calculate how much carbon emission from driving to the venue, having beef, for example, as a food and all of that. And that got me thinking. I said, oh my God, we could make an effort individually first, take a small step individually and then expand that. So coming back to legal practice and paper, me and my team, we hardly use paper. I can't remember when we print paper. Even though we go to court, with massive documents, it's all in folders and all of that. So, but you have to make an effort.
Yes.
And okay, the problem also is this: very often when you're making submissions and arguing cases, you need to have a physical copy to see. So when I go to trial, I usually have just one big, massive white file, and it's all double-sided, nothing else. I need that because I need to highlight certain things. But even that, you can learn to. It's a mindset change.
As you said, it's not that you completely eliminate the use of something. It's a practical implementation. You are consciously reducing it to the very minimum. And yeah, I think that's okay. That's perfect because it brings us to the topic on environmental, right? And we want it to be practical for the benefit of charities and really, drill in on what exactly is environmental, what exactly is social, what exactly is governance. So on environmental, my guess is this is the easiest factor to deal with. It's easy to understand, I think. And are there practices, Nhan, that can be implemented on the spot that can help charities, begin to see that they are already complying with the environmental side of ESG? Earlier, you mentioned something about
goodie bags.
Yeah, goodie bags when they are doing their fundraising and all that, right?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm risking of oversimplify things here, but I think in the spirit of keeping it very simple, if you look at environmental matters, right, it all boils down to 3 key big things, right? Energy, water, and waste. And when you try to manage your environmental performance, there are only 2 ways to look at it. First of all, it reduce consumption. The other is improve efficiency, right? So when you talk about, and this it can apply for all energy, water, and waste, you just go through the 2 dimensions, right? So now reduce consumption, you need to understand where you actually generate or consume resource. So just now I give you the goodie bags, right? But goodie bag is not only the, like the only resource that you use.
Yeah.
For an event, you also bring out a lot of leaflet, right? For example, and poster and, you disperse it. Is it necessary? Or you can do it another way, like maybe a QR code and people can just scan it and they have the informations, right? And I'm very sure some organizations already do that. And also, so that is a reduced consumption part that I was talking about. And another thing is, for example, energy, very straightforward, aircon. Most organizations use aircon. Do you need to set it so cold? Or you can actually, have it at 25 degrees and people do not need to wear jacket in Singapore. And, that kind of like small things. But then that's exactly reduced consumption that we are talking about. And another aspect of it is improve efficiency. Can you do the same thing, but, in a better way? Like, for example, again, event. Is it necessary to invite everyone to travel to the venues? Or is it better to have a virtual one? That is one of the things that we always think about. In fact, just a small, a fun story. In EY this year, we actually canceled one of our, annual conference, the physical one, and switched it to the virtual one to save on our carbon, because we know that the cost to fly everyone around is going to be very, carbon intensive, right? Just imagine Anil is a very good citizen. He used public transport. But what if other participants who will drive to your, event, right? So virtual event, same thing, right? How you communicate with your, your event participant also can be improved as well. Instead of disperse like survey form, can it done like virtual as well, so on and so forth. So if you have the mindset, and again, Anil mentioned, if you have that mindset and you understand your business well, which your operation well, and I'm sure many of you definitely will understand your operation better than I do, just go through and understand which activities that actually generate waste and consume resource, and think how you can reduce it or improve efficiency. And then you are already at a very good start for environmental, right?
So Nhan, what she's described is actually very practical
Absolutely,
points,
yes,
right?
yeah.
So I give you an example. What happened to us was this: the Association of Banks in Singapore approached us, and they said they had this SME sustainable data reporting POC. They wanted us to try and test out, and they asked us whether we'd come on board. So we straight away had to call in our HR, call in our finance, and sat down and had a brief discussion and said, would you be a test bid for us? We only approached 1 or 2 law firms to do that. And would we do that? Of course, it's a daunting task, because our HR and our finance had to break up the RHTLaw from the RHT consulting and all of the other arms.
Right.
And then break it down to paper consumption, travel, water consumption, electricity, and all of that. And it took us a long time. But once we did it and we reported back to them and they announced it at a dialogue session, it was really enlightening what we are doing and what we're not doing. So can you imagine if charities, now that you have this, like this session today, after this, the word ESG must be on your mind, right? It has to be on your mind. The minute it's on your mind, it's amazing how you'd find so many interesting things related to ESG that's coming to you as a charity and all that. So it's not going to be daunting. You just listen to someone speak about it and they say, hey, listen, we have a software that does this and we want you to test it out. Can you test it out for us? At no cost. Then you test it out, then you realize, hey, hang on a minute. We seem to be spending a lot of money on travel, or we've been spending money on water. Water, of course, you need that, right? Electricity and all those things. Then you start to pay attention and then you start putting things into place.
Was there one thing that sort of stood out to you?
From that report?
Yes, from that report. Like you were surprised?
No, actually, no. Right. But it gave us an idea of where we can pay attention.
Yeah.
It's just that we don't pay attention sometimes.
Yeah.
See, so coming back to me and traveling on the public transport and all buying food and sharing it, it just became second nature. Right. And then the guests that come as well, they like the idea. And then slowly they realize, hey, yeah, actually, I shouldn't have to spend that much on this and that.
Yeah.
So it's just an mindset, empowering and enlightening, all of these things.
Yeah.
And
I
sorry, please go ahead.
No, I think another, and I like what Anil mentioned is, I think the mindset, because sometimes when you think about environmental, they always think about, okay, what I can need to cut down on my own consumption, which is really true that you need to do that. But don't forget that by taking that action, you also send out a good message, right? You know,
Yes.
your impact is not only, okay, this office, but also to the people you interact with, your supporters, your community. And by, advocating those ideas, you actually, and in EY, we call it try to have the ripple effect, right? You try to send this out, and the accumulated impact of that is going to be significant, right? So
yeah.
don't feel like you are, it's a bit corny, but don't feel like you are too small to make any change, right?
Yeah, that's lovely.
Yeah.
And, listening to the both of you share about environmental practices, I think what struck me was that I think some charities might be of the perception that, say, for example, their mission is upcycling of plastics or maybe reducing or wait, now there are quite a few of these what do you call them? Textile waste, right?
Yes.
Reducing textile waste charities, and then they encourage people to swap clothes and all that. So they may be of the view that actually my main mission is the E, so I don't really have to think about it. But actually, when you think about your day-to-day operations, just because your charity's mission deals with helping the environment doesn't mean there's nothing else you can implement and improve.
Correct.
Yeah. So it's not true that if your mission is E, then you only focus on S&G. It doesn't work like that, right? It's all encompassing.
Okay, hypothetically, so you're focusing on that, on that, clothes and all of those things. But if you work your staff down to, like long hours and just to make sure that you can raise the funds that you need from the project, that falls under a social, aspects. Okay. And then if you have your organization is top heavy, for example, and they hardly maybe they're cross industry between their charity and something else, and then they're using all of that, then the question then comes out whether or not there's an issue of governance.
Yeah.
Right. So it's all
I think to your questions, I think if your charities focus on E, it's even more important for you to really look at your operations. Because think about it, such the irony that you advocate for such a one environmental cause, but then your own operation is not maximized, right, in terms of environmental efficiency.
Yes.
So you can really send out a message. Of course, that's your core missions, but also you can send out a message through looking at your operation and maximize your efficiency as well.
Yeah. I suddenly realized that is so true, because it will be ironical.
Just imagine I advocate no deforestation, and then I send out all the leaflet in papers.
Exactly.
Top quality paper, right? Just imagine about it. And this kind of thing is, I tell you, the stakeholders will pick it up immediately. They very sharp. They
very
will
sharp.
And in fact, just a small thing, actually they can start to question, the charity, sometimes where are you really advocating for environmental if you are not looking, you don't clean your house first, then how are you going to ask me to clean my house, right? So this kind of thing, and you've done a lot of good work. You do just want to ensure you have that consistency in the way you send the message across.
Yeah. I agree with that completely. Okay, so let's quickly move on to the social component, because Anil, you also brought that up already. So it's the perfect time to talk about it. And I shall start the discussion by dealing with a question that was raised by a participant. Does the S in ESG just refer to employer-employee relationship? For charities, does that also include beneficiaries and volunteers?
It could, because those are people that you're working with. Right. So essentially what social covers is organizations' relationship with people. Right. So as well as its policies and actions, how they impact individuals, groups, and society. So it can extend to everybody else. So can you imagine you under the ESG, you set the right framework for your employees and all that, but then, on a project, you just go grab a whole lot of volunteers, work them to the, to the,
to the call.
Oh, yeah, right. Okay, I was thinking of something else that would have come out rude, but And then how's that fair?
Yeah.
You know, it cannot be so that you must be careful about that, because social is about dealing with people.
Mm.
So not just necessarily, for example, employers, employees and all that. Then you got treatment of employees, of course, then impact on customers, partners and stakeholders as well.
Yeah.
So
Mm.
it's all encompassing as well,
Mm.
right? And you know, it's almost like you can't go out there preaching and practicing something in silo, and then you don't do it across the board.
Mm.
So, you know, I
Mm.
mean, I keep talking about the fact that, you know, we hardly use paper, but it's all the time, hardly.
Mm.
You know,
Mm.
so you can, it must be across the board. You can't just decide, oh, okay, yeah, I don't use paper for when I'm looking at this, but oh, no, every Wednesday I need to have all of the documents that you want me to sign off.
Yeah.
I need to print it out, you know, and keep it on my table,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
right? And then where's that, you know, across the board kind of thing. So yes, it is people, how you deal with people.
Mm.
And that's why I remember I mentioned to you about diversity, equity, and inclusion. When I did that program on diversity, equity, and inclusion, it was interesting because I had an international panel in my students, and every time they talked about issues, I said, "But I don't have an issue. I have all the races." When I was running my own practice, I had all races,
Yes.
I had all ages, I had all religion, and I speak all of the languages, so it was easy. And then so I said I had no problems, right? But it's interesting to see the world over there are different kind of problems about different aspects of human relations and human interaction.
Yeah.
And what might be like, you know, I could be tapping you on your shoulder here, but it's somewhere else. It may not be allowed.
Yes.
So those
Yes.
concerns also become critical
Mm.
eventually as you move forward. And when you're a charity that does work regionally and all of those things, cultural aspects become important.
Yes.
I just finished a training in international training in multicultural mediation.
Mm.
I've just been certified for that, right? And how you deal with people and how you interact with people is becoming so sensitive and is becoming so important.
True.
You know, so so that's also part of the social,
Yeah.
you know, aspects. Yeah.
And actually, I think Anil has covered a lot, like the stakeholders, and it's true, it's covered on people, but also I think for charities, actually, I think one of the topic that you rarely discuss is actually health and safety.
Mm.
That's it actually under social, right? And not only for charities, but for most smaller organizations, right? They say, okay, I have the limited resource and I need to advocate certain things. So to your point, can I work my volunteers or can I put them in a harm way, you know, to promote certain things, right? So think about health and safety is also a very key thing under social as well. What's it going to be the baseline, right?
Mm.
Yeah, you know, like, and to be very frank, right? So sometimes, right, certain activities can be dangerous, right?
Yeah.
You know, sometimes when you send, you know, volunteers to certain areas or neighborhoods, it, you know, there can be safety concerns. How are you going to ensure their safety?
Mm. Good point.
Yeah, so that's also the social, and it can be very complicated and complex, and definitely will cover all the people that you interact with as an organization.
Mm.
But if you
Mm.
think about it fundamentally,
Mm.
it's about humanity and how people treat each other.
Yeah.
So if we were treating them all right, we wouldn't have a problem. It's just that now it comes under this umbrella
Yeah.
that kind of, you know, is coming to the forefront and people are starting to pay attention. But if we naturally are decent people and you know, do things the right way, and we know how to treat other people,
Mm.
you find that it's not going to be a daunting task. You know, you won't be sitting down there on your board meeting and say, yes, on ESG. Oh my God. Okay. What have we done with our employees today? What have we done with them next week? And all that.
In fact, on the contrary, just listening to both of your sharing, it also brought to my attention and helped me realize that what can perhaps happen for some charities who are maybe heavily involved or primarily involved in social work is that if your focus is entirely on the mission, then there can be danger of issues like that, because you're so focused on achieving a certain outcome that was the whole point of your, you know, charity being set up in the first place, for example. Then you might end up putting volunteers or even staff members in a position that is uncomfortable, or where their health and safety might be compromised in order to achieve that mission.
Yep.
So I suppose now having ESG is excellent and a good opportunity for charities to take stock,
Yeah, yeah,
Right?
yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And it's not about questioning your missions, right? But more about questioning how you go about deliver your missions,
Yeah.
right? And that's why they say take into consideration of ESGs when you do your charity work. That means things about the potential environmental impact. That means the resource that you consume, social impact, as in like how am I impacting positively or negatively people in my activities, and governance. So it's not about changing your mission, but how you do it and whether
Yeah.
you have
Kind of like crystallizing your mission,
correct.
Mm,
Yeah.
you know,
mm.
with a clearer focus. And you
Yeah.
might find, because you now need to go down the path of ESGing up, so to speak, right? You then realize, hang on a minute, my mission and my vision weren't as clear as it could have been.
Mm.
And then you get a
Or
chance,
can
an
be
opportunity
improved.
to
Yeah.
improve,
Yeah.
you know? So
Yeah.
it's got secondary and then massive, you know, surrounding effect on, you know, how you run your operations.
Yeah, agree. Okay, quickly on the topic of governance, right? It seems to be, at least for charities, mostly, can we say that the code of governance itself does also cover this G aspect of ESG in a way? Because charities have a code of governance, so aptly titled, right? So would it be fair, let's say for a charity who is now starting to relook at their practice and operations, to rely on complying with the code of governance to satisfy the G in ESG?
To some extent, I think it would, you know, because, you know, you have that 6 principles, right? And what the charity serves, a mission and achieve its objective, effective board and management, act responsibly, fairly, and then with integrity, managed and planned for the future, accountability and transparency. So you're covering all of the bases, right? So it's almost like, I think, you know, if you look at it from a flip side, it's like, okay, I need to focus on E and S. The G is there for me because I've got a code and I need to
Comply with
with
that.
that anyway, right? So I can then focus my attention on E and S if I need to. You know, you can look at it that way as well.
What do you think now?
I think more or less, yeah, I think it should give you a good start, right? And in Singapore context, right, we already have quite strong code of governance. So you got that benefit that you are transparent by design, as I always say. But don't forget, right, a lot of the charities have the international operation as well, right? So the question of the governance now is that, will you apply the same standard of transparency in foreign operations, right? Will you still do the right thing if there is no code of governance in another countries? So that for me, the governance conversation is still important in the way you should start to look at the code of governance of Singapore as a start, because it's very stringent. But now the conversation, will I do the same thing in other countries? So I apply the consistent, standard. So I think that's the only thing that I think is important. And the governance is a lot about transparency, right? But transparency is actually a very loaded term, right? Transparency is, it requires you to actually have a system in place to collect feedback, right? And again, getting back to the point about talking to your stakeholders, right? Do you have the process to get the feedback from your stakeholders or their grievances? Do you have the mechanism for grievances? Like, for example, we talk about the safety issue for volunteers, right? But if they are not comfortable with the way that you allocate the work, do they have a way to voice it out? Right? Is it something like, okay, are they going just whisper to another volunteer and then next time I don't volunteer anymore at the charity? Or you actually have an email address where they can write in, right? We can write in and then say, hey, I'm not feel comfortable being sent to these areas because of my background, my gender or whatever. So that is the governance. Governance in itself is the structure, the process, and it doesn't have to be complicated. Just an email on my website so that my volunteers, my donors, my beneficiary can write into someone to so-called complain. But then that is the way you collect the feedback as well. And that's how you determine what are the material topics for you, because they tell you, right? That's
Yeah.
where your stakeholders tell you, have a process to capture it. That's also in the essence of governance. Yeah, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I really like that. That was really useful. Okay. And I think when it comes to issues like governance and all that, in fact, you talked about feedback from employees too.
Yes,
right?
anyone, yeah.
Yeah, anyone. And
Anonymously. So allow them to do it anonymously as well, right?
yeah.
Interestingly, just on volunteers, again, I'm talking about Rotary, but the next year we have a international convention here that is looking at about 20 to 25,000 people coming here.
Wow.
So I'm part of the team that's handling the volunteers. So we've got a software up, and then you just mentioned a couple of things that I think I need to make sure that we have on the platform. So the
Perfect.
feedback and then follow
Might be
through.
your consultant.
Yeah,
Consultant now.
Interesting.
That's
So
fantastic.
it's
Yeah.
caught my attention.
Yeah. I'm sure that today many of the things that have been shared really would have pricked the ears of many members of the board and leadership in charities. So okay, we're moving forward a little bit. Maybe before I move on to sustainable resourcing. Do we want to talk a little bit about the Charity Transparency Award and the Governance Award? I mean, I know that the Commissioner of Charities has encouraged everybody. I understand from that talk in April that I had mentioned earlier that the number of participants for the Charity Transparency and Governance Award is not as many. Not. I think they were looking to have a higher percentage of charities participate for these things. I suppose if you're participating, it means you have confidence, right, in your transparency practices as well as your governance. So, but I think mostly that's been more or less covered. But before I go into sustainable resourcing, let's just see if we have some questions from our participants. So somebody asked, right, maybe on the issue of social, what are the low-hanging fruits for a charity to start? Again, practical, something easy. So this person said from labor management relations to training and education. Is it okay to start from HR?
For
but I'm not
social.
sure how. Yeah. I mean, this person is thinking about it that way. Labor practices, decent work and employment, etc.
Exactly. I mean, that's a good point, because you wanna have someone in your organization canvas the social angle. It surely should start from the HR. It makes perfect sense for the HR person to be there to oversee and make sure all of those things are set in place. Right. So yeah, I think so. Was that all the person asked about?
For now, yes.
Yeah.
But the question that has the most number of votes, I feel that we should deal with it. Maybe this is a fair juncture.
Yeah.
Although I thought that we actually have more or less sort of covered it. But someone wants to know, what is the benchmark for charities? If the Commissioner of Charities is advocating and encouraging charities to include ESG, then what are the available resources that charities can consider? Now, we've already talked about Singapore Green Plan. Maybe they felt that it's a bit broad, but do you all have any comments in answer to this question in terms of resources? I know, for instance, you can definitely engage consultants.
Yes.
No, that's not the intentions. But actually talking about benchmark, right? And I know that this is a very typical questions, because I want to pass the exam. So give me the model answers, right? So benchmark is just another term. Give me the model answer, and I just follow the model answer, and I'm safe.
Yeah.
But again, to your point that I think we have tried to make throughout this conversation is that it's really not a box ticking exercise. So there shouldn't be a model answer. And in fact, you don't want the model answers, because especially for charities, right? Even in the normal business setting, the size of the organization already varies so significantly. In charity context, it varies even more, right? So some charity is like just a few people. The other charity is, huge organizations. What you don't want is like the big guy will try to push certain benchmark on you, right? So how are you going to, again, it's going back, how are you going to do it meaningfully? If you go through the proper process, like we have been talking so far, you know your organization the best, you know where you have the impact on environment and society and so on. And then if you have that process in place, no one no one can fault you for not doing it.
Yeah.
Because you have done it in the most meaningful way for
Yes.
your organization. And that is the most important. So in fact, if you are a small organization, you don't want to use a benchmark, of the big guys. Try your best, but, that's not the intention. Yeah.
I would have thought Nhan's point is exactly, coming from EY, they're very structured in the way they look at it. For me, I just fall back, hang on a minute. So why don't I just look at the code?
Yeah.
The code has the 6 principles, and each of the 6 principles have got so many pointers. If I start opening it up and taking a look at it, right, I can kind of reverse engineer, right? I mean, you have these, things that you need to do by the end of the year, right? If you know what those are, and then you set it as targets that you need to achieve, obviously, then you kind of get there. So
Yeah.
I would think that the starting point would be take a look at the code,
Yeah. Good
because
point.
that's what's going to guide you,
That's
right? Don't worry about the requirements of listed companies and all those things. Those are a different ball game,
Yes.
correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
right? So start with the code, break it down, and if you think that social part is what your HR person should focus on, go to the HR person,
Sounds good. Yeah.
right? And then
Yeah.
you may end up putting together 2 or 3 people from your organization, but it might give you an opportunity to train someone in that field, in that
Yes.
area as well.
Yeah.
Right. And, honestly speaking, if I was in one of the charities and you tell me, would you be interested in leading this, I'll put my hand up straight off.
Yeah.
Straight off. Yeah.
True. And I think nowadays, a lot of young people are very passionate about
Passionate.
this.
Mm.
So come to think of it, it shouldn't be all that difficult to get some enthusiasm,
Yeah.
going
Yes,
within the
yes, yeah.
charity.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Something practical that might be in a way also relevant to implementation of ESG is sustainable resourcing. And Nhan, I know that you have talked about this before. We know that in 2017, the National Council of Social Services launched this 4ST playbook. It was a guide for the social service sector on sustainable resourcing. But I thought that some of the principles in there might be relevant to charities in general.
Yeah.
So would you like to tell us a bit more about sustainable resourcing? What does it entail, and how might that be relevant for charities, Nhan?
Yeah, sure. So sustainable resourcing is the term, can mean a lot of different things in different contexts. So I'm just referring directly to this 4ST playbook because they have a quite a specific definition what they mean by sustainable resourcing, right? So what it means is they just want to ensure that the organization, the social enterprise, continue to get the resource that they need to achieve their missions. That's basically what that means. And they are being efficient about it, right? So if we unpack it a little bit, right, what will we mean by the resources, right? If you look at the playbook, it seems to imply that it's a financial resources, right? Where you can
Yes.
attract your donor and fund, and funders and everything. But actually, now we have talked about sustainability, right? There are different type of resources as well. The social resources, your volunteers that who are willing to sacrifice their personal time to come and help you out free of charge is the social capital. That's it, the social resource. How are you going to continue to have that kind of social resource that you can tap in to do your missions is as important, right? In addition to your financial resource as well. So one of the key thing that they mentioned under this, sustainable resourcing is diversification of the resource and how you ensure that they will continue to come, which is really interesting because you are looking at the volunteers of now or the future. Just now you mentioned that the younger generation will have a very different perspective about the charity and sustainability. They are much more aware about the whole situations. They will demand things to be run differently. Do you know, like how it's going to be different, for the next generation. You want to continue to have that pool of volunteers that want to come to your, to work, to volunteer at your charities, right? So that is the type of sustainable resourcing that we are talking about. And same thing, not only volunteer, investor, funder, donors, they are younger and younger investor now, and they're going to vote with their money, and then they will demand certain money put into the good use.
Yeah, definitely. That actually.
Could I just
Yes, Anil.
quickly add on it?
Yeah.
You know, I found this NCSS 4ST playbook very interesting. And then, you know, the 4ST stands for Social Service Sector Strategic Trust, right? Launched in 2017, no?
Yeah.
Right. To me, I thought this is really interesting because they had the foresight to think about these things. And, you know, the vision was presented as shared vision and directions to guide the sector to achieving a vision of every person empowered to live with dignity in a caring and inclusive society. And it set out the objective of the sustainable resourcing, reduce exposure to risk while increasing the ability to pursue strategic goals. So something like this done in 2017,
Yeah.
Yeah.
right? It kind of captures and it kind of summarizes what we were speaking about today, you know,
Yeah.
right? So
That
you know,
even before this
Exactly.
came into the charity sector, they had already thought about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So isn't it? I mean, I think it's kind of cool,
Yeah.
right? And
Agree.
it provides you with guidelines, and you know, it's got some very interesting things on why is sustainable resourcing important, and it explains resilience, attract funding, collaboration. It talks about a lot of things in
Yeah.
there. So
Yeah.
if you get a chance, you know, I would suggest that the audience should go and
Yeah.
take a look at this.
Yeah.
Remember, I
Definitely.
mentioned I'll send a slide deck.
Yeah.
I've got hyperlinked it to this
Therefore,
thing so they can.
perfect.
Yeah, so it'll be.
Okay, we've got about 15 minutes left, and I'd like to spend some time. I think this bit will be interesting to charities, which is communicating your ESG practices to your stakeholders. So my impression of it is that, for instance, one of the participants asked at registration, what is the ROI, right? I practice all these things. So where's my return on investment? Because it's already a cost to my charity, right? My precious funding. Now I have to set aside, you know, to some extent to implement these ESG practices. So what is my return on investments? And I think it probably will be very important to charities to think about how they can communicate this to shareholders. So the earlier part, we were concerned with reporting. Does it need to be in my annual report? You know, that sort of thing from a reporting perspective. But how do we, I don't know if it's the right word, but how do we market it, right? If we are attempting to practice all these and we want our funders, our sponsors, our donors to know about it, maybe we can give them ideas and suggestions.
Yeah.
I think the starting point is that the leadership must step up and say, listen, we need to maybe re-engineer our vision and our mission, right, to encompass these aspects. And then once you do that, you got to then set out a strategic plan of how you want to achieve that and what you want to do about getting there, right? And then if you're holding events, I suppose that event will showcase what it is. And then when you report after those events and showcase or report it in lines of ESG, and then you present that to your potential investors, it's I think it's not a tough exercise. I keep saying easy, but you know, maybe I should put it, not a difficult exercise if you re-engineer, but you need to re-engineer from the top up, down, right? You need to get them on board. Now, I don't think it's going to cost that much. You have this guide, you have all of what we just spoke about, the 4 STs and all that as a framework for you to set up an idea of what you want to do. Set out the idea, set out the agenda, set out your programs that takes care of these issues. Once you've done a successful project, report on those projects as you would do any year, anytime, right? But you angle it towards that EAS and G, right? And then people are going to start paying attention, right? And they're going to say, I like these guys. I like the style of what they're doing. I know that they're in a charity that doesn't really focus on what I want, but I like the fact that they're going down the path of ESG within and externally, and I want to be able to work with them. So, you know, the return on investment is very simple. You're going to have a far larger pool of potential people coming on board, you know, whether they're volunteers, whether they're funders, or whether they're whatever. They just, the alarm bells are going to, well, antennas are going to go up and say, I want to be on board. I want to be part of this, right? So if you, let's say if you're starting from a clean slate of what charities do I want to get involved with? And someone says, hey, hang on a minute, they've got this real clear framework for ESG. I like that. Should we go there? And it's tapped to that sustainable goals
Yeah.
and all of that. So when you start reading that and connecting the dotted lines, this is where I want to go.
Mm.
Right? So a return on investment might be very, achievable, so to speak.
Do you agree? Yeah.
I agree in the thing about having a framework is good in a way that it shows that you are doing it meaningfully, right?
Mm.
So just now earlier you say you're reluctant, and I understand why you want to reluctant to use the word marketing, because to be honest, sustainability over the past few years has picked up the pace so much that the risk of greenwashing has become an issue, right? So of course, we want to communicate, right, what we have done so far, but we don't want to run that risk, right?
Yes.
So that's why having a framework and the meaningful one, right? And that means how you are going to link sustainability to your mission or how you run your operations. It will be shown in the way that you report it. Like, for example, you have the framework, but do you have the process behind to keep track of your to keep track of your performance, and what's it going to be the way to monitor the performance moving forward? The people in the know, and eventually more of those people, when they read the report, they will be able to say it. And I know people keep saying reporting is tedious, but we are not asking you to do everything, right? If you already have the framework and agree that these are the matters that are important to you and to your stakeholders, the question I will ask you is, why are you not tracking those things in the first place if they are important in the first place, right? So again, it's a question, is it within or outside of your operation? And it will be shown, right? So don't underestimate the importance of communications as well as reporting, because that is the way for you to not prove yourself in a way, right? And tell your stakeholders that you are being serious about it. And the ROI is, I agree, it's definitely is multiple folds. Sometimes you might not be able to put a number to it, but you will definitely feel it. Yeah.
So while you maybe people may think of you saying all of this in terms of from an accountant's point of view and reporting and all of that, but you're a charity. You set up for an exercise. You need to do this. You need to be accountable for it. You need to account for report. So it's not a case of just because ESG and the new code has come on board that you have to hire another 3 people to do the reporting. It's the same thing, but a lot more targeted, a lot more focused. That might the ROIs are going to be that you might have incredible amount of people coming on board.
Yeah, I was going to say
Yeah,
too. I mean, and that not necessarily only donors or sponsors, but we're also thinking about volunteers,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
The younger people taking
Exactly.
an interest in your charity and your work,
Exactly.
because they are the ones out there who are really very well versed in sustainability development issues, right?
Yeah. Why don't you just track the number of volunteers sign up after you have your first sustainability report? I mean, the good one, huh? And maybe use it to see whether you have achieved, have you actually touched on what's important to your stakeholders?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I completely agree. Okay, so one last topic before I request for both of you to maybe offer our participants a key takeaway. Maybe we can briefly touch on ESG investing. I left it to the end because I think maybe this might be more relevant to the larger IPCs. Part of your responsibility or governance is to manage your funds well for sustainability reasons. So what exactly is ESG investing? Where should these charities begin to look?
Yeah. Okay. So, and again, actually this topic, and I'm glad that you bring it up because it's really, linked to what I talked about earlier about sustainable resourcing, right? There will be a new class of investor that look out for specific projects, right? That they want to invest in. And I kind of don't agree that it's only for the big big charities. In fact, because you are small, you need to be smart about it and try to attract those money. Let me give you an example. Just now we talk about textile and fashion, right? So a lot of organizations in this industry now, they are facing a lot of pressures to, on recycling, on how they use the material. So And you look at it, they are trying to find, like the initiative on the ground that can provide them with, like the alternative materials. And one of that is, for example, sustainable cotton grown by farmer in a sustainable way in India. Just imagine that you are the type of charities that have that focus on sustainable, environmental, trying to help the farmers in this part in India. You can immediately tap on them. Those organizations, and the thing about big organizations is, which they don't have, but charities will have, is the understanding of the local people and your beneficiary, right? They can tap on you to help them design the program that makes sense for the local people. And then you can tap on them on resource. And exactly because you are small, you need that kind of resource more than the larger charities. So, and again, and I know that I feel like I'm a broken record by now, but it's really sustainability is in or outside operations, right? If you really think, creatively, consider sustainability from that angle, right? If you understand a bit more about sustainability context of the sector that potentially that relevant to you or your beneficiary, you will see a lot of new opportunities. Another thing that another very important theme for impact investing now is actually on women and minorities, right?
Yes.
And that is exactly a lot of focus area for a lot of charities. So if you already have, a good cause, you already have the network of the beneficiaries, I'm very sure the large organization will be happy to talk to you, right? But now the question is, how are you going to showcase that? And that going back to the reporting, you need to be able to measure, to report, to showcase to the large organization, because to be fair, for every dollar they invest in you, they want to see the return as well, right?
Yes.
So you need to be able to measure that. So think of it as an investment for, for your charities as well.
That may help it to grow.
Definitely,
right?
definitely.
Okay, thank you both so much. I would like to request that you each, maybe, if there was something that you could say to our participants today. We have, I believe, online with us, leaders in the charity sector, as well as managers, executives, people who work within charities. What is a key takeaway that they should have? Should they forget a lot of the things that we're discussing going forward when they leave this place?
Okay.
Maybe Nhan, you can start.
I think the key takeaway is just actually it's simple, right? I think sustainability, don't think of it as an add-on, right? It should be part and parcel of your organizations. I know that it sounds very generic, but I hope that on the example that we have been giving today can really illustrate my point, that it can really part of your operations. If you think about it a bit harder, not only it improve your efficiency, but it will also attract the new opportunities as well. Yeah.
I think exactly what she said, perfect, the points. To add maybe just one mindset change. It's really a mindset change, but many people would say, no, come on, it's in my nature. All of what you just said, the whole last 1.5 hours in my nature, that's fine. But for many of the others, it's a mindset change. And then one quick example, the targets that you set must be achievable. I read this about a month or 2 months ago. This gentleman who announced in his social media that he's going to stop drinking beer, in line with environmentally friendly. I don't know how he related that to drinking beer, but he says, I'm going to stop drinking beer in 2035, right? But I'll do it progressively, so my buddies and all don't have to worry. I'll still be sociable and we'll go hang out, but I'll slowly reduce it 2030 or 2035. But you know what the catch was? He's 79 years old now. So go figure, right? Okay. So on that point, what I'm saying is that if you're going to set targets, make sure that targets are achievable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. That's the only
That's
thing.
perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you both so much for joining us today and your invaluable insights. I have personally learned a lot, and I really hope that the participants today have also many takeaways with them that they can implement, some really right away.
Mm.
And more importantly, I also hope that they feel more enthusiastic
Yes.
about
yes.
ESG.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not daunting, it's not daunting.
Yeah.
Yes, you
I
know,
hope they can feel our energy.
Yeah.
Like we try to
how exciting
how
and how
exciting it
feasible it
is.
is.
Yeah, yeah.
So we hope you found our discussion today useful. And at the end of this webinar, a survey form will pop up on your screen for your completion, and we appreciate your comments and your feedback. So we will use them to improve our further webinars. And if your charity needs legal advice, please email us at assistnpos@probono.sg. With that, on behalf of Pro Bono SG and our lovely speakers here from RHTLaw Asia and EY, we would really like to thank all of you for joining us today and have a great week ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Mhm.